Her sentence, "You've been keeping my seat warm for 10 years. Know your place." My answer, "One night, one silk scarf, and silence instead of her voice." They applauded my triumph, not knowing I was singing with a dead woman's voice. I took her place. Forever. The theater smelled of dust and forgotten dreams. Eliza stood center stage, illuminated by the single beam of the ghost light, a bare bulb on a metal stand left burning overnight to ward off superstitious spirits. The rest of the auditorium was submerged in a thick, velvet darkness. The rows of empty seats were invisible, but she could feel their presence. Hundreds of silent witnesses to her nightly ritual. She opened the score on the music stand. The pages were riddled with her own annotations, red ink like drops of blood on the pale skin of the sheet music. Every phrase, every breath Serafina took had been documented, analyzed, and dissected with an anatomist's precision. Eliza inhaled. Her diaphragm dropped. Her ribs expanded. Her larynx opened. The sound that poured from her was not an emotion, but a mathematical equation solved with absolute precision. An aria from Tosca, the very one with which Serafina had conquered La Scala 20 years ago. Eliza's voice was flawless. Every note hit the center of its pitch. Every transition between registers was seamless to the point of being imperceptible. A perfect mechanism. A Swiss watch in a human throat. She watched her reflection in the dark mirror of the orchestra pit below. Shoulders set at a precise 30-degree angle, chin parallel to the floor. The fingers of her left hand were clenched into a fist, thumb tucked inside, knuckles white with tension. Physical pain as an anchor, as proof of control. Her voice climbed higher, slicing into the climactic high B flat. Eliza held it, counting silently. 8 seconds. 9. 10. The sound didn't waver by a fraction. There was no vibrato, none of that organic tremor of living emotion that made Serafina's voice so damnably human. There was only pure, cold, merciless sound. She cut the note off. The silence, thick and tangible, rushed back in. Eliza lowered her gaze to the score. Her handwriting next to the notes read, "S takes a breath here. Technically incorrect, but creates the illusion of spontaneity. The public adores imperfection mistaken for passion." She repeated the aria. Again and again. This wasn't a rehearsal. It was an autopsy. The backstage corridors were a different world. Here the air was colder, thicker, saturated with the smell of sweat, rosin, and hot stage lights. The worn floorboards creaked underfoot, each plank knowing its own note in the building's symphony. Eliza glided along the wall, silent as a shadow. Ahead, at the end of Prima Donna's alley, a light shone from Serafina's dressing room. The door was ajar, a narrow strip of warm golden light cutting through the corridor's gloom. She stopped 10 feet from the door, leaned her back against the cold wall. She stopped breathing. Voices drifted from the dressing room, muffled but clear. "The tinctures aren't helping anymore." It was Agnes, the head dresser. Her voice trembled. "The doctor told her this morning. 3 months of complete rest, or she'll lose her voice forever." A pause, the rustle of fabric. "Did she agree?" Another woman's voice, younger, the makeup assistant. "You know Serafina. She'd rather die on stage than walk off it alive." A short laugh, bitter and weary. Eliza stood motionless. Her heartbeat, usually as steady as a metronome, quickened. 65 beats per minute. 70. She counted. These weren't rumors. They were facts. For 10 years she had waited. For 10 years she had been the perfect copy, the backup plan, the insurance policy in case the star should fall. But stars don't fall. They slowly fade, clinging to every last ray of light. And now, a crack. The first real, visible crack in the foundation of Serafina's throne. Not a drop of sympathy stirred in Eliza's chest, only a cold, electric jolt of anticipation. A crack meant an opportunity. An opportunity meant action. She turned to leave, and froze. At the far end of the corridor, half hidden by the shadow of a massive pillar, stood Monsieur Dubois, motionless, silent. How long had he been standing there? What had he seen? Their eyes met across 100 feet of dusty air. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just watched. His deep-set eyes were sad, not with judgment, but with the hopeless sorrow of a doctor diagnosing an incurable disease. Eliza straightened her spine, lifted her chin. She met his gaze without blinking. 5 seconds of silence stretched into an eternity. Monsieur Dubois slowly shook his head, an almost imperceptible movement. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing softly down the corridor before dissolving into the darkness. Eliza was alone again. For the first time in years, she felt a prick of something like shame. Not for her thoughts, not for her envy, but for the fact that someone else had seen the ugliness of her soul and acknowledged its existence. She clenched her fists, her knuckles bone white. Shame was a weakness. Weakness was unacceptable. She returned to her dressing room. Memory was a traitor. Eliza sat on a metal chair in her tiny, windowless room, and the past overtook her like a starving beast. 10 years ago, her first season. She had stood in the wings, weighed down by Violetta's heavy costume, a beaded and sequined cage that cut into her shoulders and constricted her chest. Her heart hammered with anticipation. It could happen at any moment. Serafina could fall ill, strain her voice, suffer an injury. At any moment, the assistant director could run to her and say, "Eliza, you're on! We need you now!" But that moment never came. Not that night. Not in the next performance. Not for the entire first season. Year after year, she stood in the shadows. She wore the costumes, learned the parts, attended every rehearsal. She knew every movement, every breath, every pause. She was Serafina's perfect reflection, more disciplined, more prepared, more perfect in every way but one. She was not Serafina. And every night, standing in the wings, she heard it. The avalanche of applause that crashed down upon the theater, the cries of "Brava!" the stomping of feet, the explosions of ecstasy that shook the walls and made the floor vibrate beneath her feet. Applause that was not meant for her. Spotlights that did not bathe her face. Fame, slipping through her outstretched hands like water. 10 years, 3,652 days. Every ovation was a knife. Each of Serafina's triumphs was another stone added to the wall of her resentment, a wall that grew, hardened, and became something both monstrous and beautiful. Eliza's apartment was a temple of order. Every book on its shelf was aligned by its spine. The bed was made with 45-degree corners. Not a speck of dust on the black countertops, not a single object out of place. Except for one wall. That wall belonged to Serafina. Posters, newspaper clippings, concert photographs, all were pinned to a corkboard with manic precision. The chronology of an enemy's career, documented with the love of a pathologist. Every review was peppered with Eliza's annotations. A divine performance. Next to it in red ink, flat note at 2:34, masked by vibrato. Serafina achieves the sublime. The comment, technically incorrect breath support at 112. The audience is too ignorant to notice. The photographs were studied with a criminalist's eye. Red circles highlighted the tension in a neck muscle during a high note, an unflattering angle of the head, the fatigue lines around the eyes. Eliza stood before this wall every night, studying, analyzing, dissecting. This wasn't the obsession of a fan. It was the obsession of a surgeon studying a patient's body before an operation. She was looking for weak points, vulnerabilities, arteries that could be severed. On the desk beneath the wall was a stack of bootleg recordings of Serafina's performances. Eliza would put on headphones and listen to them on a loop, searching for the slightest imperfection, a wavering breath, a moment of fatigue. She always found them, and every flaw she found was a small victory, proof that the goddess was mortal. The company meeting was held in the main rehearsal hall on the 4th floor. Dusty daylight filtered through the tall windows, pulling the faces of singers, musicians, and stagehands from the gloom. 60 or so people gathered in uneven rows. Monsieur Dubois stood by a battered grand piano, his tweed jacket lightly dusted. He held the touring schedule in his hands. "The schedule is tight," he said, his voice a quiet, weary baritone. 4 cities in 6 weeks. Serafina will be singing the lead roles in Milan, Vienna, and Paris. Eliza sat in the back row, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She raised a hand. Dubois paused. He looked at her over the rim of his glasses. "Yes, Eliza?" "My apologies, monsieur." Her voice was soft, almost solicitous. "Perhaps we should consider an understudy for the more demanding roles, so as not to, God forbid, overtax the vocal cords of our lead soloists. We all understand how fragile that instrument is." Silence. She saw a few people in the front rows exchange quick glances. Someone coughed. Someone looked away. Eliza hadn't asked. She had asserted. She had taken the whispers from the hallways and dragged them into the light, transforming them into an official problem, an issue to be acknowledged aloud. Monsieur Dubois stared at her for a long time. Too long. His eyes held the same sadness as they had in the corridor the night before. "Thank you for your concern, Eliza," he said at last. "We will take it under consideration." He returned to the schedule. The conversation moved on. Eliza lowered her hand. Not a single muscle in her face had moved. The seeds had been sown. After the meeting, the old concertmaster, Jean-Pierre, stopped her at the door. His fingers were gnarled with arthritis, knotted like the roots of an old tree. Yet they remembered music better than young virtuosos remembered their own names. "Eliza!" he called. "A moment!" She stopped, turned, waited. He took off his glasses, wiped them on the hem of his shirt, put them back on. "I heard you last night," he said. "You left the door to the hall open. The sound carried to my room." Eliza didn't reply. "Your voice," he continued, slowly, choosing his words, "is a perfectly cut diamond, flawless, precise, cold." He paused. "But when Serafina sings, it's like a fire in the hearth. It might crackle, it might smoke, but it's alive. It gives warmth." His brown eyes looked at her with an infinite weariness. "People will always be drawn to the fire, my child, not to the most perfect stone." Eliza nodded. Once, mechanically. "Thank you for your observation, Monsieur Jean-Pierre." She turned and walked away. She didn't take his words as advice, but as further proof of their collective blindness. They preferred flawed passion to her hard-won genius. Fine, that could be fixed. A fire in the hearth sooner or later goes out. The mirror in her dressing room was merciless. Eliza stared at her reflection in the cold light of the bare bulb. Her skin was pale, almost porcelain. There were violet shadows under her eyes, not from makeup, but from insomnia. Her cheekbones were sharper than they had been a month ago. She had lost weight. Her body had become angular, devoid of softness. She ran her fingers along her throat, feeling the tense muscles. Her larynx ached from the nightly rehearsals. She ignored the pain. Pain was the price. A fair and necessary price. Her obsession was hollowing her out from the inside, and it was beginning to show. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 weeks, only chicken broth and green tea, fuel for the instrument. The body was an instrument. It had to function perfectly. Waves of dizziness washed over her, especially after long rehearsals. She had learned to ignore them. Control through suppression. Strength through sacrifice. Eliza clenched her fist, thumb inside. She squeezed until it hurt. Physical suffering as proof of her commitment, an offering to the invisible gods of the theater. She suffered more. Therefore, she deserved more. The theater's library was in the sub-basement, a labyrinth of shelves packed with centuries of scores, librettos, and playbills. The air was dry, thick with the scent of old paper and oblivion. Eliza sat at a long oak table, a handwritten 19th century score of Tosca open before her. She wasn't reading. She was just staring at the faded notes, unseeing. Footsteps in the hall. A familiar, shuffling gait. Monsieur Dubois entered the circle of light from her desk lamp. He sat opposite her without asking permission. The silence stretched. "I want to tell you a story," he said finally, looking not at her but into the darkness between the shelves. Many years ago, there was a violinist in this theater. Talented, perhaps even a genius. But next to him played another violinist, a star, the public's darling. The first violinist spent his entire life trying to prove he was better. He practiced until his fingers bled. He gave up family, friends, sleep, all to surpass his rival. Dubois fell silent. He pulled an old pocket watch from his jacket, flipped open the cover. He glanced at the face, though he had no interest in the time. "He went mad," Dubois finished quietly. "Died in an asylum. He never composed his masterpiece, because he wasn't making music. He was warring with a shadow." He snapped the watch shut, looked at Eliza. "Don't let another person's shadow consume your own light, Eliza. Sometimes, to find your own place in the sun, you simply have to walk onto a different stage." Eliza smiled. A polite, mechanical smile. "Thank you for the advice, monsieur." Inside, she went cold with contempt. He was telling her to surrender, to run, to admit defeat. He didn't believe she could win. Monsieur Dubois stood. His tweed jacket rustled in the silence. "You're too intelligent not to understand what I'm talking about," he said from the doorway, "and too stubborn to listen." He left. Eliza was alone among the dead scores. An emergency meeting was called on stage. The entire company, singers, musicians, technical crew, 80 people huddled together under the stage lights. Eliza stood in the back rows. Her palms were damp. Her heart pounded erratically. 85 beats per minute. 90. She couldn't suppress the hope. For 10 years she had crushed it, choked it, locked it away in the furthest corner of her soul. But now hope tore its way out, like a beast that had scented blood. Now Monsieur Dubois will announce that Serafina is retiring for health reasons. Now the path will be clear. Monsieur Dubois stood center stage, a sheet of paper in his hands. His face was solemn. "It is with great joy and great sorrow," he began, his voice cracking, "that I announce to you—" Eliza held her breath. "That our incomparable, our one and only, Our divine Seraphina will grant us the highest honor. A pause. At the end of the season, she will give her farewell performance. The world shattered. Applause erupted like a grenade. Cries of delight, sobs, embraces. Eliza stood motionless amidst the jubilant crowd. A farewell performance, not a cancellation due to illness, not a forced departure. A triumphal conclusion to a career, canonization in her own lifetime. A transformation into an eternal legend against whom all others would be measured for all time. Around Eliza, her colleagues hugged each other, weeping with joy. Someone shouted, "Bravo!" Someone else applauded until their palms stung. She looked at their faces. She saw the ecstasy. She saw the love for the woman they were escorting into immortality. No one looked at her. No one saw her dying. 10 years of her life, 10 years of sacrifice, all turned to ash in a single sentence. Eliza didn't remember how she got to the old set pieces backstage. This labyrinth of plywood walls covered in peeling paint hadn't been used in years. It smelled of mold and neglect. She stopped in front of a large mirror in a heavy gilded frame, a prop from some long-forgotten production. The glass was coated in a layer of dust. Eliza stared at her reflection. A stranger looked back at her from the murky glass. Her eyes were dry but wild. Her mouth was twisted in a silent scream. Her face was a mask of agony. All the pain of 10 years, all the humiliation, all the suppressed rage converged at a single point in her mind. The liquid despair crystallized, hardened, transformed into something sharp, cold, and absolutely clear. The rules were unfair. The world was unfair. Playing by the rules of an unfair world was foolish. If she wasn't given a chance, she wouldn't ask for one. She would take it. Eliza raised a hand. She touched the mirror, leaving a fingerprint on the dusty glass. The victim died in that mirror. In her place, something else was born. Something hungry. Something willing to do anything. The cold came from within. Eliza stood before the mirror in her dressing room, and for the first time in 10 years, her hands were not trembling. Her pulse was steady, 60 beats per minute. Her breathing was controlled. The rage that had burned inside her an hour ago had been incinerated, leaving behind only a crystal-clear, icy purpose. She was going to kill Seraphina. The thought brought no fear, no hesitation. It was the logical conclusion of a simple equation. The world is unjust. The rules are written to keep her in the shadows. And the only way to change the outcome is to rewrite the score with her own hand. Eliza ran her fingers over her throat, feeling the larynx. The instrument was ready. All that remained was to remove the obstacle. A burst of laughter echoed from outside her dressing room. Someone shouted instructions to the stagehands. The rumble of moving sets vibrated through the walls. The pre-show chaos, ordinary, familiar, inevitable. Eliza opened the door and stepped into the corridor. The world continued to move around her. A ballerina hurried past, her slippers pattering on the floorboards. 2 technicians dragged a heavy spotlight, bickering as they went. The assistant director rushed by with a binder under his arm, his face red with stress. No one looked at her. She was a shadow, invisible, perfect for what had to be done. The plan was simple, dangerously simple. Eliza didn't devise intricate schemes. She had an advantage no one else could possess. 10 years of observation, 10 years of studying Seraphina's every habit, every ritual. She knew. 30 minutes before the third bell, Seraphina sent away even her most devoted assistants. Vocal meditation, she called it, a sacred ritual. 30 minutes of absolute solitude in her dressing room with the door locked. Everyone respected this ritual. Not even Monsieur Dubois dared to disturb it. 30 minutes. A window of opportunity. Eliza leaned her back against the cold wall in the shadow of a pillar, from where she had a clear view of prima donna's alley. She watched as Serafina's young assistant, Clara, exited the dressing room with a tray. The porcelain cup was empty. The herbal tea had been drunk. The ritual had begun. A few minutes later, Monsieur Dubois appeared. He paused at the door, exchanging a few quiet words with the person inside. Eliza couldn't hear the words, but she saw his slight bow, a gesture of respect. He closed the door and walked away. The corridor was empty. Eliza counted. She measured the minutes with the beat of her own heart. She waited for the chaos in other parts of the theater to reach its peak, for everyone to be too busy to notice an empty hallway. 22 minutes until the third bell. It was time. The first step out of the shadows was the hardest. Eliza pushed herself away from the wall. Her ballet flats were silent on the thick carpet, but the old floorboards beneath it creaked. Every sound was like thunder in the quiet corridor. She walked past the dressing rooms of the other soloists, all empty. Everyone had gone to the stage to prepare. Ahead, at the end of prima donna's alley, the door with the brass nameplate glowed. Engraved in ornate letters were the words, Serafina d'Avalon, prima donna assoluta. Eliza stopped before the door. In the polished metal of the nameplate, she saw her own reflection, a pale face, huge, nearly black eyes. Her mouth, a thin, hard line. This was the last moment, the last chance to turn back, to return to her own tiny dressing room, to remain a safe shadow, invisible, innocent. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Serafina on stage, the spotlights turning her silver hair into a halo, the audience on its feet, cries of "Brava!" An avalanche of applause shaking the walls, and Eliza in the wings, in the shadows, again, forever. She placed her hand on the doorknob. The cold brass seared her palm. She turned it. The door opened without a sound. Serafina's dressing room was bathed in the soft golden light of the bulbs framing the enormous mirror. The air was thick and warm, heavy with the scent of tuberose and something else, the sharp medicinal smell of throat spray. Serafina sat before the mirror in a burgundy silk caftan embroidered with gold thread. Her ash-silver hair was swept into an elegant coiffure. Her fingers, adorned with massive rings, rested on the vanity amidst a scatter of crystal bottles and silver-backed brushes. She raised her eyes, meeting Eliza's gaze in the mirror. There was no fear on her face, only a lazy, condescending curiosity. "What a surprise," she said, her voice a velvet contralto laced with faint mockery. "Have you come to ask for an autograph before my triumph, mia cara? Or have you come to see what real talent looks like?" Eliza closed the door behind her, turned the key in the lock. The click echoed loudly in the silence. Serafina raised an eyebrow. Her lips curved into a thin smile. How dramatic. How touching. Eliza moved closer, stopping behind Serafina's chair. Their reflections met in the mirror. Two faces so different. One still full of life, arrogance, and confidence. The other, a pale mask with dead eyes. "I've come to take my life, Serafina," Eliza said, her voice even, devoid of emotion. "You built your fame on my bones. This night should have been mine." A pause. Serafina burst into laughter, a low, rich, contemptuous laugh that filled the room and struck Eliza's face harder than any slap. "Yours?" Serafina swiveled in her chair to face her directly, her violet eyes flashing. "Don't make me laugh, child. The public doesn't want flawless dolls.
They want fire, passion, humanity.
She made an elegant theatrical gesture in the air.
You have technique, you have discipline, but you have no soul. You are an empty vessel playing at opera.
Every word was a knife. Eliza stared at her, listening to that laugh. That dismissive, annihilating laugh. For 10 years, she had heard variations of those words. From critics, from colleagues, from herself in the darkness of sleepless nights. Something inside her broke. The control she had so meticulously constructed over the years. The icy calm with which she had entered the room. It all shattered. Only rage remained. Primal, pure, all-consuming. Eliza's gaze fell to the vanity. Among the bottles and brushes lay a silk scarf, bright red, embroidered with gold thread. An expensive gift from some noble admirer. Serafina was still laughing, turned back to the mirror, not taking the threat seriously. Eliza moved. One swift motion. She snatched the scarf. The silk was cool and smooth beneath her fingers. She threw it over Serafina's neck from behind and pulled. The laughter stopped. It turned into a rasp. Serafina tried to stand, but Eliza threw her full weight into it, pressing her against the back of the chair. The prima donna's fingers clawed at the silk, trying to slip beneath the tightening noose. It was useless. Eliza pulled harder. Their reflections in the mirror, a grotesque, ugly dance. This was not opera. This was a slaughter. Serafina thrashed, struggling. Her foot knocked over a perfume bottle. The crystal shattered on the floor, and the heavy scent of tuberose exploded into the air, mingling with the smell of fear. Eliza never took her eyes off Serafina's in the mirror. She saw them widen, saw the understanding flash in them, the shock, the terror, and finally, the acceptance. The violet eyes dulled. The body went limp. Eliza held the scarf taut for another 10 seconds, counting, making sure. Then she released her fingers. Serafina slumped from the chair to the floor like a broken marionette. Silence. Absolute, deafening silence. Eliza staggered back. Her chest heaved. Her hands were shaking, for the first time all evening. She stared at the red scarf in her hands. The silk was crumpled, stained with dark smudges of sweat and Serafina's makeup. A body lay on the floor, motionless, dead. Eliza sank to her knees. Not from grief, not from remorse, from simple physical exhaustion. She had done it. This wasn't an autopsy, not a rehearsal, not a fantasy. She had killed Serafina d'Avalon. The irreversibility of the act crashed down on her, not as a wave of emotion, but as a cold, mathematical realization of fact. Her old life was over. Her new one had begun. The clock on the wall kept ticking. The world outside continued on, unaware that a legend had just died inside this gilded cage. Eliza lifted her head, looked at the mirror. Her reflection stared back, pale, lips parted, eyes wide. The face of a murderer. Footsteps. Quick, light footsteps in the corridor. A woman's carefree humming. A melody from the first act. Eliza froze. Her heart, which had just been beating steadily, exploded into a frantic gallop. 120 beats per minute. 130. Panic washed over her like an icy wave. The footsteps were getting closer. Very close. La donna è mobile, qual piuma al vento. The woman hummed from outside the door. Marie, the young dresser. Eliza scrambled to her feet. She looked around like a cornered animal, the body on the floor. the scarf in her hands, the shattered bottle. Evidence everywhere. If Marie came in now, it was over. The whole plan, all the sacrifice, would turn into a pathetic farce. She would be arrested right here, among the shards of crystal and the scent of tuberose. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. "Madame Serafina?" Marie called. "Pardon the intrusion. I'm just bringing the flowers from Monsieur Dubois." The doorknob turned. It met the lock. Eliza stopped breathing. "Of course." Here is the translated and adapted next part of the text. Her gaze darted around the room, searching for an escape, a solution. In the far corner stood a massive folding screen. Upholstered in dark green velvet, it sectioned off a small area with a sofa where Serafina usually rested between acts. Eliza moved. Adrenaline made the impossible possible. She grabbed Serafina's body under the arms. The dead weight was incredible. The head lolled back lifelessly, the silver hair undone. Eliza dragged the body across the carpet. Every inch felt like a mile. Her muscles burned with the strain. Another knock came from the door, more insistent this time. "Madam?" Eliza hauled the body to the screen and pulled it behind. On the small velvet sofa lay a pile of shawls and wraps. She awkwardly lowered the body onto the sofa, trying to arrange it in a natural pose. The arms, the legs, the head. The neck was at the wrong angle. Eliza grabbed one of the cashmere throws and draped it over the body, trying to hide the unnatural bend. "Madame Serafina!" Marie was jiggling the handle now. "Are you all right?" There was no time. Eliza scrambled out from behind the screen and scanned the room. The shattered bottle. She quickly swept the shards under the vanity with her foot. The red scarf. She stuffed it into the pocket of her dress. A deep breath. An exhale. She went to the door but didn't open it. She pressed her forehead against the cool wood. She summoned all of her acting skills. 10 years of observation. 10 years of copying every intonation. "Leave them there, Marie, darling," she said. Her voice came out hoarse and petulant, a perfect imitation of a weary Serafina. "I am meditating. I don't wish to see anyone." A pause from the other side of the door. An agonizing, endless pause. Eliza clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "As you wish, madame." Marie's voice finally came, uncertain but obedient. "I'll just leave the bouquet by the door." The footsteps receded. Eliza slid down the door to the floor. Her hands were trembling. Her whole body was trembling. She had cheated death. For a moment. For a minute. But this was only the beginning. Getting to her feet, Eliza forced herself to move methodically. She scanned the room with an investigator's eye, looking for evidence, for mistakes. The vanity, a drawer was slightly ajar, likely pulled open during the struggle. She moved closer and peered inside. Among old programs and letters lay a medical form, an official seal. Bold letters. Diagnosis: laryngeal cancer, stage 4. Prognosis: inoperable. Eliza froze. Serafina was dying. Not in months, in weeks. That was why she'd planned a farewell performance, a final triumph. She was going to leave on her own terms, not wait for the disease to turn her voice into a rasp and her fame into pity. Eliza slammed the drawer shut. It didn't matter. Serafina was dead. The cause wasn't cancer. The cause was the red silk scarf in a murderer's pocket. She turned. Her gaze fell on the mannequin against the opposite wall. A stage costume hung on it. A dress of heavy blue velvet, embroidered with pearls and silver thread. The costume for tonight's lead role. Serafina's costume. Eliza walked toward it, ran her fingers over the fabric. It was cool, perfectly tailored. It smelled of French perfume and glory. 15 minutes until the third bell. The decision crystallized in her mind. She tore off her simple black dress and threw it to the floor. She lifted the costume from the mannequin and put it on. The fabric flowed around her body, heavy, expensive, alien. But now it was hers. Eliza went to the mirror and looked at her reflection. The woman in the mirror was not her. She was a tragic heroine, a queen, a goddess. She took Serafina's lipstick, a blood-red shade, and applied it to her lips. A sharp, hard line, the final touch of the mask. Outside, the third bell rang, its tone low and solemn. 5 minutes to curtain. Eliza turned. She walked out of the dressing room, locking the door behind her. The corridor was empty. Everyone was in their place. She walked toward the stage. Her ballet flats made no sound on the carpet. A ghost in a stolen dress, walking toward a stolen triumph. The glow of the spotlights shimmered ahead. They were waiting for her in the wings. "Madame Serafina," the assistant director hissed. "At last! We were worried." He fell silent when he saw her face. Eliza walked past him without a glance, without a word. The orchestra began the overture. She stepped onto the stage. The light hit her face. Blinding, hot, absolute. Beyond it, the darkness of the hall. Hundreds of invisible eyes. The music swelled to its climax. Eliza opened her mouth and sang. The voice poured not from her throat, but from the very depths of her soul, from the dark place where rage, pain, envy, and despair had been collecting for years. The murder hadn't broken her. It had freed her. Every note was a confession. Every phrase was the cry of 10 years of silence. She wasn't playing a role. She was living it. The final note hung in the air, then faded. A second of silence. Then the hall erupted. Applause crashed down like an avalanche. Cries of "Brava!" The stomping of feet that shook the floor. Eliza stood center stage, bathed in the light of the spotlights. She had won. Silence. Eliza stood center stage, blinded by the spotlights, and heard an absolute, supernatural silence. The final note had dissolved into the air. The hall had stopped breathing. She didn't move, didn't blink. Her hands were frozen in the aria's final pose, her right pressed to her chest, her left extended toward the unseen audience. It lasted an eternity. 1 second. 2. 3. Eliza could hear her own heart beating, the pulse throbbing in her temples, the low hum of the lights overhead. This wasn't a performance. It was an act of creation, born from destruction. And then the silence exploded. The hall descended upon her in a tidal wave of sound, a roar, a single, deafening roar of 1,000 voices merging into a primal scream of ecstasy. Applause beat like hammers. Waves of "Brava!" crashed over her. Somewhere in the back, someone was stomping their feet, and the sound reverberated like thunder. Eliza staggered. The sound wave was a physical force pushing her back. She felt it in her body, the pressure, the vibration, the energy of 1,000 souls surrendering to her. This was more than praise. It was an acknowledgement of power. She lifted her head. Through the blinding glare of the spotlights, she could make out silhouettes. The entire hall was on its feet. Every seat was empty. 1,000 people standing. For her. Eliza brought a hand to her heart. Slowly, with regal dignity, she bowed her head. Flowers. They rained onto the stage. Red roses, Serafina's symbol, fell at her feet. Dozens. Hundreds. Eliza straightened, her gaze sweeping over the velvet-covered stage, now carpeted with blossoms. Every flower was a voice saying, "You have won." She bowed again. The applause didn't stop. It grew louder. Someone in the front row, an elderly man in a tuxedo, pressed his hands to his face. His shoulders were shaking. He was weeping. Eliza saw the woman beside him shouting her name, but the sound was lost in the general roar. Her lips formed the words silently. Genius. Divine. She bowed a third time. In that intoxicating moment, Eliza believed. She believed that this triumph could wash away the filth, that the deafening ovations could drown out the quiet whisper of her conscience, that every flower thrown at her feet was an absolution of her sins. She had killed, but now, under this downpour of adoration, the crime seemed like a distant dream, unreal, impossible. How could the world admire a murderer? Therefore, she was not a murderer. Therefore, it was justice. The curtain fell to a new wave of cheers. Eliza stepped behind the velvet wall and stopped. Backstage, there was silence. Not an empty silence, a reverent one. Her colleagues were lined up along the narrow passage behind the stage. Choristers, orchestra musicians, technicians. 50 people, frozen in unnatural stillness. They stared at her. Eliza walked slowly between them. Her steps were soundless on the thick linoleum. No one spoke, no one moved. A young ballerina on her left pressed her hands to her chest. Her eyes were wide, glistening with tears. The bassist, leaning against his instrument, gave a slow nod, a gesture of respect, an acknowledgement of an equal. Old Hans, the lighting technician who had worked in the theater for 40 years and seen hundreds of performances, took off his cap. He held it in his hands as if at a funeral. Eliza walked past them, maintaining her silence. Their reverence was a mirror. In their eyes, she saw a reflection of what she had become. A goddess, a monster, a queen. Eliza. The voice stopped her. Monsieur Dubois stood at the far end of the corridor. His tweed jacket was slightly rumpled, his gray hair disheveled. He looked older than usual. Eliza froze. He approached slowly, unhurriedly. His face, usually a mask of weary sorrow, was an expression of pure, unadulterated astonishment. He stopped. He adjusted his glasses. He began again. I have no words. A pause. That was beyond. His voice trembled. Monsieur Dubois, who had seen Callas's debut, who had worked with Pavarotti, who had spent 50 years among the greatest voices in the world, could not find the words. Eliza stood motionless, not trusting herself to speak. I always knew you were technically flawless, he continued quietly. But tonight I heard a soul, a real, living soul. He reached out a hand and touched her shoulder, a light, fatherly gesture. Serafina would have been proud. Those words struck harder than any accusation. Eliza nodded. Once. Mechanically. Thank you, monsieur. Her voice came out as a croak. Dubois stepped back, clearing the path. Eliza walked past him. She headed for Serafina's dressing room. Her dressing room. The corridor was empty. Eliza's footsteps echoed off the walls. Her ballet flats whispered over the carpet. Every sound seemed too loud in the ensuing silence. The roar of the crowd still rang in her ears, a dull, pulsing hum. But with every step, it began to distort. It transformed into something else. Not an ovation, an accusation. Not adoration, a mockery. The adrenaline receded like an ebbing tide, leaving behind a void. A ringing, cold emptiness in her chest where her heart used to be. Eliza stopped in front of the door with the brass nameplate. Serafina d'Avalon, prima donna assoluta. Her hand rested on the knob. The cold metal burned her palm. A body lay behind this door. She turned the knob and entered. The dressing room greeted her with a scent, the heavy, sweet fragrance of tuberose. Serafina's perfume. It still hung in the air, mingling with the aroma of the fresh roses someone had left by the door. Eliza closed the door behind her, leaning back against it. The room was just as she had left it an hour ago. The vanity with its scatter of bottles, the mirror framed in lights, the massive screen in the corner behind which... Eliza didn't look in that direction. She walked to the mirror. The woman in the reflection was a stranger. A blue velvet dress embroidered with pearls. Perfect makeup, blood-red lips, lined eyes. Hair swept into an elegant coiffure. A diva. A prima donna. A queen. But the eyes were dead. Pale gray, almost colorless, they stared out from the mirror with an expression of bottomless exhaustion. There was no trace of triumph in them, only fear. The cornered, hidden fear of a trapped animal. Eliza raised a hand, touching her own reflection. The glass was cold. Somewhere far away, beyond the walls of the dressing room, the muffled applause could still be heard. The audience was demanding an encore, but here, in this gilded cage, the sounds seemed like mocking laughter. She had won the crown, but she had placed it on the head of a monster. The door flew open without a knock. Eliza spun around. Two young ballerinas, Sophie and Anna, burst into the room. Their faces were radiant with excitement, their cheeks flushed.
Eliza!
Sophie shrieked.
My God, that was absolutely killer!
The word struck her like a slap. Killer.
You literally murdered the audience with that last aria,
Anna added, grabbing her friend's hands.
I've never heard anything like it.
Murdered. Eliza froze. The innocent, ecstatic words pierced her like white-hot needles. Her smile froze on her lips, twisting into a grimace. They know. They all know. This is a cruel game. A hint. A mockery.
Thank you,
Eliza forced out. Her voice was too sharp, too high. Sophie blinked, her smile faltering.
Are you all right? You're so pale. Exhaustion.
Eliza turned back to the mirror.
Forgive me. I need to change.
The girls exchanged a quick glance and backed toward the door.
Of course. Sorry to bother you.
They left. The door closed. Eliza collapsed onto the stool in front of the vanity, her hands shaking. A drop of cold sweat trickled down her spine. They knew nothing. They were just words. Ordinary, harmless words. But paranoia had seeped into her mind like a poison. Every glance felt like scrutiny, every word an accusation. She had won, but now she had to live with the secret forever. Footsteps in the corridor. Slow, heavy, shuffling. Eliza froze, listening. The gait was unmistakable. Monsieur Dubois. Her heart plummeted, crashing against her ribs. He wasn't coming to congratulate her. He had already done that. He was coming to judge her. Eliza rose from the stool, turning to face the door. Her muscles tensed instinctively. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. A dark silhouette appeared in the doorway. Monsieur Dubois stopped on the threshold. He didn't enter. He just stood there, looking at her. There was no smile on his face, not a trace of joy. Only the heavy, prolonged gaze of a doctor looking at a terminally ill patient. Eliza met his gaze, forcing herself not to look away. The silent duel stretched for an eternity. He knows. He sees right through me. He sees the blood on my hands, the fear in my soul, the monster beneath the mask of triumph. He's going to say it now. He's going to ask where Serafina is. Eliza was ready to run, ready to fight, ready for anything except forgiveness. Monsieur Dubois slowly entered the room. His gaze swept over the luxurious disarray of the dressing room. The flowers, the costume on the mannequin, the screen in the corner. He stopped in the middle of the room. He pulled the gold pocket watch from his jacket, flipped open the cover, looked at the face. Eliza stopped breathing. It was a ritual. His ritual for making an important decision. He was going to speak now. Dubois snapped the watch shut. The click was loud in the silence. "You're singing tonight, Eliza." A pause. His voice was hollow, cracked. It had such depth, such a dark, primal passion. Eliza froze. "I always believed you had perfect technique, flawless discipline." He raised his eyes and met her gaze. "But I never suspected that you had such a soul." The words stunned her. He wasn't accusing her. He was praising her. He was praising the very monster she had just unleashed. The darkness born in the moment of murder. The irony was so monstrous that the room began to spin. "Thank you, monsieur," she whispered. The words stuck in her throat. Dubois nodded. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Ah, I almost forgot." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. Eliza tensed. Monsieur Dubois pulled out a sealed envelope. Thick, cream-colored paper. Addressed in an elegant script were the words, "To Eliza Vance." "Serafina asked me to give this to you." He held out the envelope. "Right after the performance, she said it was very important." The world stopped. Eliza stared at the envelope as if it were a snake. Serafina. The last words of a dead woman, written before her death, before the murder, before the triumph. It couldn't be a coincidence. When did she give it to you?" Eliza's voice was barely audible. "This afternoon, before rehearsal." Dubois looked at the envelope thoughtfully. She was in a strange mood, calm, almost serene, as if she had made some kind of decision. Eliza reached out a hand and took the envelope. The paper was cold, heavy, like a tombstone. "Thank you, monsieur." Dubois nodded, turned, and his footsteps faded down the corridor. The door closed. Eliza was alone. She stood in the center of the dressing room, holding the envelope with both hands. The triumph, the flowers, the ovations, it had all become a cheap set, an unreal backdrop. The only reality was this rectangle of paper. Eliza walked to the vanity, sank onto the stool, and placed the envelope before her. Serafina's handwriting was large and sweeping, every letter a work of art. To Eliza Vance. Not dear Eliza, not my darling Eliza. Just a name. Cold, official, final. Eliza ran a finger over the paper, feeling the rough texture of the expensive stock. What was inside? A confession? She had known about the diagnosis, known she was dying. Had she decided to make a grand exit, leaving one last message? An accusation? Had she guessed Eliza's intentions and written a posthumous letter naming her killer? A curse. Vengeance from beyond the grave, a final knife in the back. Eliza held the envelope up to the light of the bulbs framing the mirror. The paper was too thick. Nothing showed through. She could choose not to open it. She could burn it, destroy it. But Serafina had known her too well. She had known that Eliza could not live without knowing. It was a trap. Perfectly orchestrated, the prima donna's final aria. Eliza looked at her reflection in the mirror. The woman in the stolen dress, with traces of a stolen triumph on her lips, held the last words of her victim in her trembling hands. She had won. But Serafina had turned her victory into the most exquisite form of torture. The threat of exposure had been replaced by the absolute terror of the unknown. Eliza placed the envelope on the vanity and pushed it away. Not now. Not here. Behind the wall, a body was growing cold behind a screen. The audience was demanding an encore. The world was celebrating the birth of a new star. And she sat in a gilded cage, a prisoner of a dead woman's last words. Eliza closed her eyes. She heard the ticking of the clock on the wall, the distant roar of applause, her own breathing. She was not the victor. She had never been. Serafina had outplayed her before the game had even begun, and this envelope was the proof. Eliza stood in the middle of the dressing room, and the world shrank to the size of the envelope in her hand. The triumph was dead. The paranoia had receded. All that remained was this thick, cream-colored paper, sealed with Serafina's wax monogram. It was heavy. Impossibly heavy for a few sheets of paper, as if the paper had absorbed the weight of a destiny. Eliza slowly sank onto the stool in front of the vanity, the very stool where Serafina had sat an hour ago, where she had died. The leather of the seat still held the warmth of another's body. Eliza placed the envelope on the glass surface. Next to it lay crystal perfume bottles, silver-backed brushes, spilled powder, and the red silk scarf coiled in a careless knot. The murder weapon. She looked at her reflection. The woman in the blue velvet dress stared back. Blood-red lips, perfect hair, the mask of a prima donna. But her eyes were dead. Eliza reached for the envelope. Her fingers trembled. She forced them still, clenched her fist, unclenched it. Control through suppression. She slipped a nail under the edge of the wax seal. A dry crack. The seal broke, revealing the folded paper within. Eliza froze. One last chance. The last moment she could remain in ignorance. But Serafina had left her no choice. She knew Eliza too well, knew that curiosity, the need to know, would consume her from the inside out. It was a trap, perfectly orchestrated. Eliza unfolded the letter. The handwriting was large and sweeping. The ink was a deep violet. The first line hit her harder than a blow to the chest. To my shadow, my reflection, my successor, Eliza. Eliza reread it, again and again. The words did not change. Successor. Not murderer, not betrayer. Successor. Her eyes darted further, greedily consuming the lines. If you are reading this, it means I am dead. And it means you have done what you were made to do. A pause. Do not be afraid, cara mia. I do not blame you. On the contrary, I thank you. The air rushed out of Eliza's lungs in a single, sharp exhale. Thank you. Her hands gripped the edges of the paper so tightly that it crinkled. She read on, delving deeper into the labyrinth of another's mind. I saw you 10 years ago. Young, ambitious, hungry. You had flawless technique, but you lacked a soul. Not because you didn't have one, but because you had never truly suffered. Eliza swallowed the lump in her throat. Great art demands great sacrifice. Not performed, but lived. You were a perfect vessel, but an empty one. I decided to fill you. The words blurred before her eyes. I knew of your obsession. I saw you studying my every move. I heard the hunger in your voice when you rehearsed my arias. You hated me with the same passion some people reserve for love. It was beautiful. Eliza lowered the letter. She looked at the screen in the corner of the room. Behind it lay a body, the body of a woman who had planned her own murder. Her hands trembled more violently. Eliza forced herself to return to the letter. I made your choice easier, my child. Perhaps your curiosity led you to look in my desk. You saw the diagnosis. The vanity drawer, the medical form. Laryngeal cancer, stage 4, inoperable. I had months left. Months of a slow, humiliating decline, a voice turning to a rasp, a body betraying me before the eyes of the world, the pity of critics, oblivion. The handwriting grew sharper, the pressure of the pen heavier. I chose a different ending. Tragic, beautiful, eternal. Eliza closed her eyes. A coldness spread through her veins, turning her blood to ice. She was not a murderer. She was an instrument, a pawn in another's game. You gave me the greatest gift, Eliza. You turned my death into a legend. The prima donna, murdered at the height of her fame by her own understudy. What a perfect tragedy. The critics will write of it for decades. My name will become synonymous not only with talent, but with sacrifice for art. Eliza opened her eyes, staring at the words in disbelief. And you, my dear, you have finally gained what you lacked. Darkness. A true, lived tragedy. You have killed. You have crossed a line most people are afraid to even look at. And that darkness has filled your voice with the very passion it was missing. The memory of the performance. The voice, tearing out from the depths of her soul. The applause shaking the walls. I heard you tonight, Cara. I heard you until my very last breath. And it was magnificent. Eliza set the letter down on the vanity. She stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. 10 years. For 10 years, she had thought she was fighting a battle. But she wasn't fighting. She was being cultivated, molded, prepared for a single role. Every condescending glance from Serafina had been a lesson, every humiliation, a test. The announcement of the farewell performance, the final push, the trigger. Serafina hadn't just foreseen the murder. She had provoked it, planned it, directed it. Eliza wasn't a murderer. She was an actress in someone else's play, performing the part written for her. The final lines of the letter were short. Do not blame yourself, Eliza. You gave me what I wanted. Immortality through tragedy. And I gave you what you could not achieve on your own. Greatness through suffering. Wear my crown well. Sing with my lungs. Live my legacy. You are no longer a shadow. You are my continuation. The signature was a flamboyant, elegant flourish. Serafina. Eliza sat motionless. The relief of not being exposed lasted for a second. One short, deceptive second. And then came the realization, far more terrifying than any prison. She was free from the law, but she was forever enslaved by the will of a dead woman. She had achieved everything. The stage, the fame, the recognition she had craved for 10 years. But it was not her victory. It was Serafina's. Every future triumph for Eliza would be a triumph for her creator. Every ovation would be an echo of applause for the dead prima donna. She hadn't replaced Serafina. She had become her vessel, her living monument. Eliza lifted her head, looked at her reflection. The fear was gone. The paranoia was dead. All that remained was a cold, grim clarity. The struggle was over. She had lost before it had even begun. But in losing, she had gained everything she had ever wanted. What a perfect, twisted irony. Eliza rose from the stool. She walked slowly to the mirror, stood so close her forehead almost touched the cool surface. A queen stared back at her, but the crown on her head was forged from a red silk scarf, and her throne was built on a foundation of lies and blood. She saw her future with terrifying clarity, a series of triumphs on the world's greatest stages, critics marveling at the depth of her performance, never knowing the source of that depth. Audiences falling in love with the tragic power of her voice. But in the quiet moments, alone in her dressing rooms after the shows, she would always feel a gaze upon her. The gaze of the dead woman who had created her, who lived on through her, who controlled her from the grave. Eliza no longer belonged to herself. Her life, her voice, her soul, all had become instruments to sustain another's legend. She reached out a hand, touched her own reflection in the mirror. Her fingers slid across the cold glass, tracing the outline of her face. Not her face. A mask. A mask crafted with a surgeon's precision from ambition, envy, and a genius's manipulation. Eliza looked through her own reflection, addressing the one who stood invisibly behind her. There was no hatred in her gaze, only a dark, respectful acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of a student who had finally understood the lesson. The acknowledgement of a pawn who had realized the scale of the game. The acknowledgement of a creation bowing before its creator. She stepped back from the mirror. She still clutched the letter in her hand, her coronation decree, and her eternal sentence. The dressing room was quiet. The light from the bulbs around the mirror cast a radiant halo, turning the room into a sanctuary. Behind the screen in the corner lay a body, but Serafina was not dead. She had simply changed her form. She had moved into another vessel, younger, more perfect, more obedient. Eliza folded the letter, neatly, along its original creases. She placed it in the pocket of her dress next to her heart. It would stay there, always. A reminder, a chain, a crown. She walked to the vanity. She picked up the red silk scarf. Smooth, cool, innocent. An instrument of murder, a symbol of power. The seal on a contract she had signed with her own hands when she had choked the life from Serafina. Eliza slowly wrapped the scarf around her own neck, tied it in a knot. Elegant, loose. She looked at her reflection. The red silk was a stark slash of color against the blue velvet of the dress, like a drop of blood on fresh snow, like the seal on a pact with the devil. An absolute silence fell over the dressing room. The clock ticked on the wall. In the distance, muffled voices hummed, the theater slowly emptying after the performance. But here, in this gilded cage, time had stopped. Eliza stood before the mirror, a queen in a stolen crown, a diva in a borrowed dress, a shadow that had consumed the light, only to dissolve within it. She looked into the eyes of her reflection, and in the depths of her mind, in the place where a part of the old Eliza Vance still lived, she uttered her final, most sincere thought. Not aloud, silently, addressed to the only audience member whose opinion mattered. To the woman who had died, yet lived on. To the woman who had lost the battle for her life, but won the war for immortality. Bravo, Serafina. It seems this was your greatest aria after all. Eliza turned. She walked out of the dressing room, closing the door behind her. The corridor was lit by dim lamps. Her footsteps were silent on the carpet. She walked straight, her back erect, her head held high. The new prima donna of the theater, the heir to the legend, the eternal prisoner of another's genius. Behind her, in the locked dressing room, behind the velvet screen, a body grew cold. But Serafina d'Avalon had not died. She had merely moved, And now she lived in every breath, every note, every triumph of the woman who thought she had killed her. The curtain had fallen, but the performance had just begun.